Hello, welcome to the Social Justice Forums. I am your host, Daren Jaime, and we thank you for joining us. If you're asking the question, what is this show all about? We bring you a forum that's providing a deeper understanding of the issues and inequities that many communities face. From systemic inequalities to pressing social problems, our guests provide multiple perspectives as well as insights, helping us to better understand and address the challenges. So we invite you to stay connected to us. The Social Justice Forum starts now. And welcome back. With the Golden Globes now in rear view, the Mirror and the Oscars fast approaching, the awards season is now full in swing. These events draw millions of views each year, but offer the questions: whose interests are best served? Again, why do these award shows even exist? Our next guest is a film and media historian at Ball State University. Her book, The Oscar Industry, examines the socioeconomic history of the award shows, offering insights on how these giving practices build racial class and gender hierarchies within the entertainment industry. And we've got joining us now to talk about how her latest work pulls back the curtain on Hollywood's biggest nights, the assistant teaching professor at the Department of Media at Ball State. We've got Dr. Monica R. Sandler. And Dr. Sandler, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Thank you. I want to start off by saying, to the average person, it's a great opportunity to see somebody be awarded at the highest level at award shows. That's the average person. To those people with lenses, sometimes there's a very quick look at disparity, selection, process, the whole 9 yards. And I know you've given some work to this. So tell me, what was it that really intrigued you to get this work started?
Mhm. I've been weirdly fascinated with the Oscars for basically as long as I can remember. Like, I'm just a total dork. Like, if you asked me in high school, you're gonna write a book someday, what would it be on? I would have said the Academy Awards. I don't know why they fascinate me so much, and it's not even like it's the complexity of this event and the kind of worlds and ecosystems and systemic inequalities that are all built around something that is so shiny and glossy, that I think has always fascinated with me and just has gotten more kind of bigger and more complex reading my parents' Entertainment Weekly subscription as a kid and all of that stuff. So it turned into a really kind of deep archival study that I've been doing a long time now.
And so you've done these deep archival studies and you take us back, all the way back to the inception. And when we look at where we are today, a lot of people could see some progress, not much, but what we can see is hierarchy. When you look at the Oscars, talk to me about the hierarchy that you find in there.
Mhm. Yeah, so I think when we're talking about the history of the Oscars, the number one thing to really think about is like what the event is doing for like these are events, but they're celebrating a workforce that are working in an industry. And what that ultimately means, like the Oscars are really like even with the best picture category, a producer wins best picture. It's not we think about it as a film winning best picture, but a specific producer wins this picture. So they're celebrating workers in an industry. And what does that ultimately mean? So one of the things that I look at with the founding origins of the Academy Awards is going back to their roots. So the Academy actually started as a fake union in 1927. Essentially, what that means was most of the workforce unionized into IATSE in 1926, with the exception of actors, writers, and directors. The Academy was created to be a mediating body for those groups, trying to kind of prevent them, because they were better paid, higher division workers, from unionizing. So it was sort of a negotiation place with all those pesky kind of collective bargaining rights, like being able to form a strike and things like that. It did not last long. But I always think about the Oscars within the context of what this organization was doing ultimately as a workers group. There's, I think, best summing it up there's a quote from Louis B. Mayer, who's often credited as one of the founders of the Academy and one of the originators of the idea for the awards, where he says, "I found the best way to handle workers was to hang medals all over them. If I got them cups and awards, they'd kill themselves to produce what I wanted." And then he doubles down at the end and directly says, "That's why the Academy Award was created." So
Mm.
he's very direct about some of those elements in there. Um, but one of the things that I really focus on is, what is that relationship? What does it mean for the workforce striving for success, and what's ultimately a collective medium, which I think is sort of summed up by what Mayor is saying.
Yeah. When I talk about the Oscars, or when we talk about the Oscars, obviously the Oscars have been controversial for some time. Some of the selections that have been made, the omissions that have gone on, what we call the Oscar snub. Give me a
Yes.
little bit about your research on Oscar snubs and your take.
Mhm. Yeah, well, certainly, the range of snubs there, that I think every single year there's a sort of gambit of discourse and commentary in the aftermath of the ceremony. But I think some of the most egregious discussions, of course, have been about sort of the exclusion of people of color and minority groups at the ceremony, which we're at the decade of hashtag Oscar So White, I guess the sequel, because it started in 2015 after 2 years of no nominations for people of color in between 2015 and 2016. The Academy announced that they were going to increase their diversity numbers. And so there has been an increase in representation at the ceremony. There have been a number of firsts in the past couple of years. This included the first Asian woman to win Best Actress, the first American Indigenous woman nominated for Best Actress, which was 2 years ago. But there have been some really big breakthroughs in terms of diversity in Hollywood. But there's also been kind of a drastic expansion of the membership and more international memberships present. So, when we think about like what gets snubbed, so much of it is about like, what does the voting body look like, and whose voice is actually being heard amongst the membership.
Yeah. I think,
for us, yeah.
good. No, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Keep going.
I'm good.
Okay. So when we talk about these snubs, obviously that's it's like the Monday morning quarterbacking that goes on for, for this.
Yeah.
But there's a little bit of a history here, because when I think about and hear about what you say, that the origin, if you will, of the Oscars was almost like a PR move.
Yeah. So one of the founding purposes of the Academy, they were described as the advancements of the motion picture arts and sciences. And like, what does that actually mean in some sort of a context? So in addition to the labor issue, which I was mentioning before, they're really geared up towards kind of Hollywood has a really big image problem at this point in time. So they're facing national censorship potentially. And this is around the time when they introduced the production code, with this sort of view of Hollywood as a den of sin. So the Academy was really about providing an alternative image of a more sophisticated and artistic Hollywood. And they have these sort of national campaigns that they do that are designed around making Hollywood look kind of bigger and more sophisticated, more artistic in terms of merit. Some of this actually goes back to, in 1915, there's a court case called the Mutual Film Corp decision. This was a case where it was about local censorship of a film production company. And the case, sort of declaratively, the court said that the film industry was an industry, plain and simple. But that meant that they were ineligible for First Amendment rights. Basically, that you're a novelty item, you're an economic industry, and you're not a craft, or you're an art, and therefore we can censor you because you are not subjected to the same type of provisions that come from artistic freedom. So there's this big push. This is sort of the origins of like, why does the Academy created? Why does Hollywood want to make themselves into an art form? It's so that way they can get First Amendment rights, basically, that they can have that creative freedom and stop being censored the way that they had been. So the really brilliant thing about the Academy Awards as a sort of distinction and some of the kind of constant stream of backlash that we get around the event every year is that it changed the conversation. So it went from is film an art form to sort of an annual declaration every year from the Academy. These are the greatest works of the year. And a sort of stream of backlash that turns from is film an art form to no, they're wrong. This film is better. This film was better. And so the kind of backlash and the discourse that emerges from that, often disagreeing and outweighing the Academy, it becomes a really important part of completely changing the conversation, even if, sort of ingrained in that is completely disagreeing with what the Academy comes back with overall.
Yeah. When we think about the Academy, the nominations come out, people are excited. Then you get to that place of that final decision. And, in many cases, some things are expected, some things are not expected, some things are way unexpected. We find a lot of people like, where did this come from? How did this happen? There's no way. Kind of reminds you like sports, You look around and you're like, okay, Monday morning quarterbacking. But when we get there to really assess the Oscars, what are some of the things that we can look at and say, we got some conceptions and some misconceptions, preconceptions and misconceptions?
Yeah. So, I mean, a lot of the discourse that emerges kind of disagreeing with the Academy, like even when we think about like more awards, the New York Film Critics Association Awards emerged in 1936. Like they are very open about like, we disagree with the Academy and we're better suited to make a declaration about what is good than those crazy people, out of touch people in Hollywood, basically. But so the idea that they are, the Academy is completely overlooking things becomes kind of an ingrainment in building the awards culture. Is like let's totally like mock and backlash at the actual Academy itself. So I think that's an important part of it. As well as just some of the discourse that ultimately occurs when you have the snubs and scandals are things like I talk about the origins of things like Oscars So White, but the conversations that emerge about what does it mean to be represented and not represented at the ceremony become really, really important. And they've been going, this is Oscar So White, which was a decade ago, was not the origin of that conversation. It had been happening since the 30s.
So as we look at the Oscars right now, from your perspective, give us some insight, some predictions.
So this year, a couple of, I think, really interesting things may happen when the nominations come out. The first is that this may be the year that has the most nominees, international film nominees in the history of the ceremony for Best Picture. So there's likely 3 major contenders that may get Best Picture nominations. This is Secret Agent, which is a Brazilian film. It was Just an Accident, which is a Iranian film, but it's co-produced with France. And finally, Sentimental Value, which is a Norwegian film. So that'll be the most number or the largest number of international films or foreign language films that have ever been nominated for Best Picture. This is really reflective of the transformations of the membership body in the past decade, where you've made the Academy a more global organization. The other big thing is that they're adding a new category to the ceremony, which is the Best Casting category. So that'll be kind of a new set of contenders at play, and expect it is very possible that one of the nominees or more may break the record for the most nominations in the history of the ceremony with a potential 15 nominations. So that would be a big deal, but it is also partially because there's now a new category that people can contend in, and but a record may be broken with the nominations coming out.
Yeah. So after the award, you got a winner. We pick a winner. Mm-hmm. They're out there. Mm-hmm. Lights, camera, action. Right.
Yes.
It's more actually, I think, for the actor, actress. It's more that comes after this, right? Because once you win an Academy Award, for many, I'm not going to say all, for many, it's a game changer.
Yeah. And that's really what's at the center of motivating The award system is this idea, like this is, as I said, this is an event. These are workers' prizes. This is a career maker, and it helps ensure more opportunities for you going forward. I mean, we really focus on the acting categories a lot of the time, but I think looking at some of the kind of what we think of as technical categories at the ceremony, things like the sound categories, editing, cinematography. I mean, these are the types of things that help ensure that people get their next job. And of course, the way Hollywood works, you have a division of workers who are independent contractors. They're hired job by job, and they're waiting for their next call, but it helps ensure creative freedom on the opportunity. And of course, having a team that you work with over and over again and what their next positions are going to be. It's also why, the award season is so valuable, where you have events that most of these workforce divisions have their own award shows. I mean, they're not the Oscars, but they help ensure that people keep getting opportunities. And I think that's what really fuels kind of the core of what's going on in the award season, beyond just the kind of PR machine that we see every year.
Yeah. We hear a lot about missing the mark, how the
Mhm.
Oscars is notorious for really missing the mark. There are a lot of moments that have happened in society, a lot of moments that have happened culturally. And for Best Picture, the Academy seems to fail there, right, and missing the mark.
Yes.
So why, I don't know. I'm at a loss for words. I'm really not at a loss for words. I can't use all the words I want to use here, but I
Mhm.
do. But I do think that there's something to be said for a whitewashing, and I think there's something to be said for this lack of cultural competence.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, and certainly, I figured out a long time ago, or fascinated with the awards for a very long time, that the merit of a film often only went so far. It was about the kind of campaigning that was going on, but it also is about sort of like, what does representation look like amongst those memberships?
Mm.
One immediately thinks of something like Green Book a few years ago, winning Best Picture over Black Klansman and Black Panther that year. But when you have a membership body that is predominantly white and male, they choose stories that are told from a white and male perspective, and often overlook stories that are actually made by minority voices. You have a film about like the experience of the white driver of a jazz musician, and like how he overcomes racial and his own racial intolerance and things like that. And that becomes sort of, okay, this story is focalized through what the average member looks like at the organization. And this has been kind of the byproduct of just sort of an entire history of sort of systemic exclusion that's existed, the types of films that are ultimately celebrated, often denying the voices, of minority groups, with a few exceptions, but a very sparse history overall.
Yeah. When we talk about the voting and the voting process
Mhm.
at all, um, the demographic of those, we
Mhm.
talk about, we hear diversity, equity, and
Mhm.
inclusion in the
Yes.
Academy Awards, right? Amazing.
Yes.
But that diversity, equity, and inclusion, first of all, took forever to get there. And second of all,
Mhm.
I'm not sure quite it's arrived.
Yeah. Well, I think the big thing to note about what happened after Oscar So White was that the Academy announced they were going to double the diversity of their membership in 2020, which they did succeed at. But diversity was, something like 80, right? So we also have to keep that in mind. But also, the way that they doubled their diversity was essentially by they made themselves a more international organization, and that's been really reflected at the organization, at the kind of awards. What we're seeing, when Best Picture, that there may be a record set for the number of international films ever won, but this was a different problem than what people were speaking to when they were posting about the Oscar So White issue. The Academy is just reflective, or at least in its history, has been reflective of the diversity challenges of Hollywood, and they become a focal point that really draw attention to those issues. But it's really been about the core problems of kind of opportunity for people of color and for women in the industry. And the Academy solved this problem with diversity by becoming a more global and international organization, which has also been a historically exclusionary issue within the organization. In the 1950s, some of the Academy branches had barred people who were not American from being in the organization. So there are systemic issues at play there too, but they're separate. But it's made the organization more global and more international. It's led to really groundbreaking victories, like a film like Parasite, winning Best Picture, which I did not think was possible that year when it happened. I was just as shocked as everybody else, because it had never happened before either. But it still solved, not addressing the core issue at play, though there has been increases in representation for people of color, Americans of color, at the ceremony. And I think there have been cultural conversations that have impacted diversity in Hollywood. But the way the Academy itself solved or addressed the issue was not addressing the issue, basically.
Yeah. So if I point to the future, how do we, in your mind, reimagine the Oscars, the Academy, in a way that is, culturally appropriate, and at the same time, just really, gets the job done?
As the Academy, which is 98 this year, or the Academy Awards are 98 this year, they're I think the evolution of the awards, it really comes down to, the Academy being reflective of a wider film industry, that some of the time the conversation can get shielded by, talking about shiny trophies and talking about the Oscars, and how do we focus on making opportunities more bigger, and there being more opportunities for minority voices to really shine. We think about this year a film like Sinners, which is very likely to do really, really well with the nominations, which, Brian Coogler was a massive hit that kind of no one expected as an original film. But if we think about like how many other films were there last year like Sinners, and it shouldn't be a film like Sinners, but the kind of gambit of many films like Sinners coming out every year. And that, that comes into the Oscars because Hollywood itself is transforming.
Yeah. Hollywood is transforming, and I think that as it transforms, people have expectations, and the expectation is that we would move the needle some. And some would argue that that needle is moved, but the question is how far that needle is actually, that needle is actually moved. In all of your research of looking at, at this, what stuck out to you and what surprised you the most?
Some of the things that most surprised me were just how kind of direct some of the members of the leadership were. Things like the mayor quote that I noted, where he's just saying like the Oscars are designed to have an effect on the workforce, that kind of thing. But I think some of what I found most surprising was just sort of realization of how impactful the awards are to the workforce. That, you have these moments, particularly like the late 1940s, 1950s, where there's a direct correlation between a lot of studio workers getting fired and the launch of events like the Directors Guild Awards, the Writers Guild Awards, the Ace Eddie Awards, the American Cinema Editors Awards. But that there's this direct correlation between when kind of the strife and the challenges of the workforce have been as escalated, and that their awards become this sort of necessary item to help fuel opportunity for people in a really kind of desperate situation for those creatives who are in the industry.
For people who want to find out more about your book and your writing and the work, because you've done some great work, I mean, the history, the research, it comes out right here, and I know people will definitely be excited to put their hands on your work. So how do they go about that?
Book is called The Oscar Industry. It's forthcoming. To find out more, my website, monicasandlerphd.com. It also links to some of my published academic, as well as talks I've given, and other writing I've conducted about the Oscars.
And how much time have you had to really, when people say, I put this book together and I researched, I know, but give our viewers an estimation of how much time you spent in the research lab really looking at this.
Yeah, so for this project, I was granted access to the Academy's archives. So looking at internal records of the organization, I spent about a year specifically looking at the internal documents. They previously have been classified, so no other scholars have actually looked at this material and information. So I did research directly at the Academy for about a year, but I've also been working and doing additional research. So this project started in my PhD program in like 2018, 2019. So it's been a labor of love for a long time. And as I also said, I've been fascinated with the Oscars since I was a kid. This was always the dream project that I've just been so fascinated with and been studying for as long as I can remember.
And I mean, I think about it, how many people get to really take a look at the archives of the Oscars?
Yeah.
I mean, even for a journalist, to be able to get their hands
Mm-hmm.
on that, it doesn't happen
Mm-hmm.
much. It doesn't happen often.
Mm-hmm.
So for yourself, I
Yeah.
know it's got to be this great feeling of something that you've known and you know, admired for years. Now to
Yeah.
be able to be directly connected. What's that like? I mean, it's part I gotta
Mm-hmm.
be the doctor, but I gotta, you know, a little geeking as a fan, you know, talk
Yeah.
about the balance, you know?
I mean, there's nothing more kind of magical than, I mean, it's when you spend the day at the archive, if this is like hours and hours of just looking at papers and papers, and you can go a little crazy. But when you find something that's really impactful, like it's always fun when I'm at an archive when there are other scholars there, and suddenly you hear someone gasp because I just seen, and even sometimes like you'll find something that's the most minute detail that means nothing to anyone other than you, but you're like, oh my gosh, I had this hunch and I was correct. And they just laid it out for me. And like, oh my gosh, like all of this is accurate. And like, this is something that's really, really teeny tiny, but like everything makes sense now. It's magical. It's all I can describe. Like there's nothing like it really. I mean, if you have the patience and the stamina to look at thousands of documents, most of which are not necessarily relevant to what you're looking into, and then you find it, it's like, wow.
Yeah, yeah. And for people who are, you know, just taking the outside look, looking in, and looking and seeing the Oscars, and they say, oh, you know, this show, it's few hours, but there's so much more to it. What was the biggest surprise for you as you started looking at the depth and the history of the Oscars?
The biggest surprise I think I found was just the extent to which it started to influence wider issues, where you can see kind of directly a really good example of this. And we kind of have a hunch about like, well, what was the after effect of a victory like Hattie McDaniel's win, where, you know, she was the first person of color to win an Academy Award, notoriously for performing as a mammy stereotype in Gone with the Wind, which there was a lot of kind of critical discourse and people felt really complicated about it because it was one of those like, you know, she gave like this performance and she's being recognized and this is a moment of progress, but like this film is dangerous and, you know, what is the after effect of it? But I think what I found, like some of the discoveries I found were like, you know, this is when we talk about sort of institutionalized problems, like there's documentation of producers when they're being called out on systemic racism, like directly saying like, well, we gave a person of color an Oscar in 1940. We gave Hattie McDaniel an Oscar. Like
Yeah.
there is no racial exclusion in the industry. An organization that I've actually written a paper that's currently in the process of being published. I wrote on an organization called the Interracial Film and Radio Guild Awards,
Well,
which were put out.
and Dr.
In,
Sandler, they're telling me I got to wrap.
no
Thank you so much.
worries.
Thank you so much for joining us. We got to bring you back.
It's been an absolute blast, and the Interracial Film and Radio Guild Awards are fascinating, and I
Yes.
have an article coming out about them if anyone is interested at all.
Thank you. Dr. Monica Sandler, and she's a film and media historian at Ball State University. Thank you for watching the Social Justice Forum. I'm Daren Jaime.